Welcome to Danish Policy. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And this is our week in review. How are you, Crispin?
It's been a whirlwind. It has been a really amazing week. A lot has happened, as everyone who watches this podcast would be fully aware.
Yeah.
But I don't have any regrets so far, touch wood. Obviously when money runs out and we all plunge into poverty and so on, that might be different. But at the moment, I'm very happy with the way things went. My biggest fear in resigning and creating the video was that no one would watch it. That basically it would all be for nothing. No one would get any attention.
Yeah, even I was fearing that too. I was like, are people actually going to watch this? People even care, per se. Like, it's just so controversial.
So for anyone who for whatever reason may not be aware, I resigned from my government position where I was a senior part of Lottery West, which is a government-owned lottery, the only one in Australia that's government-owned, and also a unique business in the world that it gives all its money back to the community in statutory and direct grants. So this is very different to my actual background, but I love this organisation so much, so I was happy to devote a portion of my life to it. And the allocation of grants, which is via the Lottery West board, was no longer being done purely on the basis of alleviating harm or promoting well-being, with us being neutral arbiters, but actually promoting particular social worldviews in excluding organisations and groups that didn't subscribe to the board's worldview. So that was what motivated me to turn whistleblower and go public. And I was fearful that a few things would happen. One, no one would watch the video that I made, that I wouldn't be able to get interest from any media groups or politicians, or that my colleagues would just completely disagree with me and that they have a completely different view. And on all of those counts, it has been completely the other way, vastly more so than I could have imagined. We've got overwhelming support from basically everybody. So the media has been running reports on this. The view of the video we put up had the fastest growth in views of all the videos we've done so far. Of the 100 or so videos, we're almost there. My colleagues have just outpoured with messages of support. They actually blocked all of YouTube at Lottery West.
This, but
which
makes people want to watch it more.
Well, strides and effect. I mean, this is one of the many problems Lottery West has right now is I'd be one of the people who would be managing crises like these when they come up. So if I was in the office and someone had said the suggestion, oh, maybe we should block YouTube so people don't watch the video, I would have been the person sitting there being like, that's a really dumb idea, because if you block YouTube, every single person is going to watch it. Right?
Yeah, guaranteed.
And so it was just, that was a first, but without sort of getting hubristic about it, it just I'm glad that my colleagues had tuned in and watched it. So thank you for that, and thanks to the media and other commentators who have chimed in as well.
Yeah, I think I have seen the flip side. I have seen people kind of disagree with your opinions of, I only think because they don't like the individuals. They don't like Margaret Court because she is a prominent figure. Like, of all the charities and organisations that Lottery does support, Margaret Court is a very prominent figure.
Yeah, the comments that I've seen, and these were comments when the first issue came out, was that it's a church. Churches shouldn't get tax exemptions. They have so much money, blah, blah, blah. Why is Lottery West giving money to churches? And I think that just reflects a lack of understanding about the way Lottery West operates. So I don't take those comments at all personally. That's reflects the view of people who say that regardless of whether it was Lottery West, just generally that government shouldn't be supporting church groups. From a Lottery West perspective, we don't look at the organisation itself. We look at what is the grant that's being proposed,
Mhm.
and does it have the probity, the insurance, the governance arrangements in place? Does the proposed money that they're asking for reflect the outcomes that they are likely to achieve?
Mhm.
And if it does all of those things, then we should give the grant. And that would be the case if it's a church group or an ethnic kind of society, or the stamp collectors group of Australia. Like, it doesn't matter. It's entirely about the actual grant and whether it has those arrangements in place. So the fact that it happens to be a religious organisation is totally immaterial to whether or not the grant should be approved or not. So when people criticise, they're not actually criticising in this specific case. They tend to be making comments like churches shouldn't get money, right? And then you have the odd comment that says, people who have a certain view shouldn't get money. Well, that's just something that, from a public service perspective, is not appropriate, right? Like, the government is not there to police people's thought, right? Government is there to provide services, and service everybody in the community. So, and I guess there is a philosophical point there where people kind of want to cancel, J.K. Rowling because of her trans views and things like that, as if all the books that she wrote and all the countless millions that she encouraged to read, and all the things that she contributed to, women's groups and shelters and domestic violence groups and all that sort of stuff, none of that matters.
Yeah, she lost her status because she donated so much money, I've heard.
Yeah, she lost her billionaire, whatever it was, status because of her donations. So that's there are people that believe that, if you said or did something years ago, or you believe something that sits on one side of the political aisle, then everything else you do counts for naught, and that is just not a how can I say, adult way of approaching someone's human value. And that was a problem that I had with the Lottery West board. Is like, it doesn't matter what this church does or what Margaret Court does or what she was proposing to do in this instance, which was to deliver food to more needy people, because they didn't like her personal opinions. And that, that's something for people to just put in their own private life in terms of how they approach these issues. But as a government service, that's totally immaterial.
Yeah. The government should represent all views. All
legal. Like, there is religious groups in our community: Baha'i, Sikh, Islamic, Hindu, and they have similar views on same-sex marriage to Christian groups, and there are Christian denominations, Catholic, Anglican, and so forth. You don't police the thought of every single person in the country, and you don't say, okay, well, unless you believe a certain set of edicts handed down from on high by your government masters, you are no longer able to participate in the group body politic. That is totally antithetical to democratic norms and is applicable only for theocratic dictatorships.
How can people, I guess, recognize this? Because I think we all have our own biases within ourselves, and we don't mean, like, I personally, like, as an everyday person, I personally don't mean to what's that word? Isolate people based on their religious views or whatnot. But, like, it's really, I don't know, I find it quite confronting. And sometimes it's very easy for me as a general person to just jump on the bandwagon and be like, for sure, like, this person does not deserve grants or whatever, because it's so radical what they're promoting in there. Yeah. Like, how do people just...
Well, if you look at, and if you believe that if someone thinks differently to you, they don't deserve the same access and rights, i.e., if someone is against same-sex marriage, they don't deserve government services, then you have become radicalized, right? And if we think about radicalized in various ways, such as, radical terrorism, right? what that requires is for people to adopt a set of religious precepts, not question them, not weigh them up against the values of the broader society and community in which you live, particularly in the West, and therefore say that everybody else that doesn't subscribe to these particular precepts that I believe must be less than human. They're enemies of God, right? And therefore, it is not only justified, but a religious imperative under, say, jihad or whatever, to wage conflict against the enemies of God, right? And that's why through things like the Charlie Hebdo case, you know, the beheading of a poor teacher who just showed some cartoons, that the people who did this absolutely believe they were doing the right thing, because the people who, you know, defame the Prophet Muhammad, for example, don't deserve to live, right? And that's, you know, I'm taking an example there, but it's the same thought process. If you say that someone who doesn't believe that same-sex marriage is legitimate, right, does not deserve the same human rights and privileges under law as we have in the Western liberal traditions as somebody else who believes something different, then you are radical in that same way. I'm not suggesting that you commit acts of terror, but it's the same thought process. You've dehumanized somebody based upon a view that is different to your view, and therefore justified in your own mind the prejudice against that individual in other irrelevant areas, right? So it's important to, as basic Enlightenment principles, one of the great achievements of the West was to be able to say that regardless of what you believe, and you have a right to express yourself, and that you have the same privileges under the law, right? And if we talk about, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment in the US Constitution, which made it illegal all across the federal states to have any form of slavery, right? It wasn't that people were being asked to agree that people who are African American were exactly the same as everybody else, right? There was still deep entrenched racism, and in fact, of course, Abraham Lincoln himself said plenty of racist things over the course of his professional political life, right? It was a matter of, okay, but should they have the same rights under the law, right? And that's the main thing, okay? It's like, do they have the right to the protections of the Constitution? Do they have the right to express themselves freely? And do they have the right to live freely and own property? Well, that was what the debate at that time was about. It wasn't until like the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement where the sense of like true equality, you know, colorless society, no segregation of any kind, that became the norm. And unfortunately, we're drifting in the other direction now with this intersectional stuff. So there was this idea with Martin Luther King that I ever dreamed that everyone will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And now we're kind of drifting back the other way in some bad areas, but in the reverse sense, it's sort of, different groups have privilege and oppression and all of that sort of stuff. So the point is, you have right to be prejudiced. You have bias, is sort of the answer to your question. There's nothing wrong with having a bias, okay? You should be aware of those biases, and you should be willing to reevaluate those biases, and that shows a penchant for growth and openness and understanding. But you shouldn't be punished for having bias. It's how you actually behave in the world that matters. So let's say you're biased against a certain group of people, and you don't let that bias impact your professional decisions, right? So let's say you're a health promotion expert, and you have a program where you want to get a number of recruits and they fit a certain demographic, and you know that some people from a particular ethnic background would benefit from that program and they've applied, but you have a bias against them. If you excluded those people on that basis, then you've actually done something in the real world to make the world worse, right? Whereas if you say, okay, look, I have a bias against these people, but they would benefit from it and I want them to participate, and so you bring them in, Well, that's tolerance, that's inclusion, that's what it should be about. That's the ideal of our society.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we're drifting in the other way, where it's like we're willing to use coercive power in our own world to enforce our prejudice. So there's a lot of bias against Christians among left-wing activists, and that I can understand that because they've been in opposition for a long time. But when left-wing activists use the coercive powers of the state to make it harder for Christian groups to fully participate in that state, then the left-wing groups are becoming radicalized.
Yeah, I do think that, I don't know, I guess Twitter's a really bad example, but because that's where it's like, and Reddit as well. Yeah, I do think there's times where I feel like, man, I wish everyone could just have a mirror to themselves and just to see who they actually are. Maybe it is a lack of self-awareness. Maybe you ride on the train and then you get so far down that you can't get out.
Well, it's the one thing that has gone really badly with, and Twitter has certainly contributed to this trend, is that people now associate opinions with righteousness, right? Like, if you, let's say, believe in same-sex marriage, well, then on the left side of politics, you're a good person, right? And if you don't believe in same-sex marriage, you're a bad person. And that is a really terrible way of interacting with the world, right? Because from that perspective, it says that the only people that don't believe in same-sex marriage are hateful bigots, and therefore they don't deserve the same rights. Now, there's several things in that statement you could pull apart. First of all, are they all hateful? And I think very few people that I meet generally on either side of this debate are hateful people, right? There are plenty of people who are in Christian groups who just see it as a heterosexual institution that aligns with the precepts of their own faith. That say that that the aura of respect that people have towards marriage in Judeo-Christian countries is because of religion, even if they themselves did not actually have a religious ceremony. It does have a certain level of social respect, and if it didn't have that respect, then gay couples wouldn't want it in the first place. Now, my personal view is that that's all true. It doesn't justify excluding same-sex couples from that institution, which is why I support same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
But I don't think that, like, I think you can make a legitimate argument from a religious mindset that, you know, it's not for same-sex couples. And people who have that view are not hateful people. They actually, from their own perspective of love and affection, think it's good for everybody, including same-sex couples, if that's the case.
Yeah.
But from a left-wing point of view, they're not that generous. They'll say that it's, you know, the only people that have this view are hateful bigots, and therefore those people don't deserve any rights, which is the other part of that equation, which I also disagree with, which is like, even if you were a bigot, even if you were homophobic, you still have absolute rights to be a full participant in the community and in a society, and within the bounds of like social harm, be able to express your views freely. If you think that that a certain way of living is sinful and against God and whatever, if you say those things in good faith and you're not vilifying individuals or attacking people, that, you know, if you're not actually inflicting harm, you're just expressing a view. Well, that's a good thing too, because it means that you can have a debate, you can have a discussion, and you either amend your views, or the points that you have that may be valid can be informing the debate, so as that everyone's argument becomes more sophisticated. Either way, you should be welcoming people into the society, into the groups, if they have a different view to you.
Yeah, and how hard is it for people just to be like, you believe in same-sex marriage and I don't, or whatever. Like, I do, but like, you know, and just be like, okay, cool. And even people who don't believe in it doesn't mean they go out there and be like, you shouldn't get married. They're more or less like, I don't believe in it, but I'm just not going to engage in it, and I'm just going to follow the Bible, and that's what the Bible says, and there's that. Like, and I'm just still going to respect you as a human being. It's kind of like drugs, right? Like, some people believe that we should criminalize drug people who use drugs, but I believe like, nah, we shouldn't throw people in jail for something that they're going to use for their personal use. Like, it's such a, and that's the thing that came up as well, is harm. People thinking that ideas are harmful, right?
Oh,
Different
yeah.
ideas are harmful.
And only theocracies should think that way. Like, if you can't question a logic, if you can't question a set of precepts, if you question same-sex marriage in any way, that you're a bad person, then you're not living in a free democracy, you're living in a theocracy. Yeah.
Okay. Happy news. Any happy news? Since you're now more free, what are you doing with your time? Even though this week has been kind of chaotic with media. But...
Yeah, so this week has not been free. This week has been busier than I can remember in recent memory, but I'll give a recount of some of the stuff I was doing. So had some interviews with some journalists. So Paul Garvey wrote a nice column today in the Australian, which is really good.
I'm going to show the paper. Who has a physical paper nowadays? I just this typical Gen Z.
Such a novelty for Charlene. Pick up actual physical paper.
Yes.
We don't even really have that many open wood fires anymore to use it as the kindling sort of fire starters. But that's quite a good article. And I won't read the whole thing because I'll encourage you to go out and buy it and read it yourself. But this is the only comment I've seen so far from Lottery West responding to any of the things that I said. It says a spokeswoman for Lottery West said it should be noted that Mr. Rovere's opinion was based on access to limited information. That is it. Now, the obvious question then for people at Lottery West would be, if I have limited information, what am I missing? What have I not disclosed that would shape people's public opinion in a way different to the story that I've accounted? And I think that is literally the strongest thing that they've got, because they can't say anything because there isn't anything else. My information and knowledge is quite sufficient to understand what has happened here, and they have been unable to counteract that.
And I find that really prevalent, especially, we talked about earlier, is Hansard. Now, do you want to explain to people what Hansard is?
I will. I'll just want to give another shout out to Gareth Parker, also, who interviewed me on 6PR. Thanks, Gareth, for that.
Yeah, that's available online.
That's available online, so we'll leave a link in the description so you can go and listen to that. My phone reception wasn't the best, but otherwise it was fine.
It was a solid interview. I was like, this is why YouTube exists. I was like, you're a natural.
Well, no, I'm not a natural. That's the thing. Like, you actually spend a lot of time in front of the camera and in front of the microphone, and you develop those skills to communicate clearly and concisely through these mediums. And thankfully, that helped me in that interview. And so that was, it was a good conversation. And Gareth said, look, he's reached out to the Lottery West board, inviting them on the show. I too would love to see the Lottery West board get on there and have a discussion. I'd be happy to have a discussion with the board on air. That would be really fascinating to have. So is it for the benefit of the WA public? That would be really good. We'll pause here and then we will dive into Hansard.
Hansard. Now, I think for the general public, I don't know if anyone knows this. I only learned about this last year, but with all parliamentary discussions, they're all recorded in what's called Hansard, and the public can go in and see what was talked about that day. And Lottery West came up a lot. So I don't know. Do you want to give a brief down and
Yes, this is good, useful information for anyone who wants to understand how parliamentary proceedings work. Hansard is the formal recording mechanism for the Australian Parliament, so both federal and state. And anything that is said during a session of Parliament or in an estimates committee or in an inquiry is recorded in the Hansard for formal record. And members of the public, except for those few things that are discussed secretly in camera, so intelligence agencies and things, the vast majority of all government business is fully accessible at any time to members of the public to go and have a read.
I'll be honest, the website's kind of clunky, but
The WA parliamentary one is a bit. I think the federal one has been refreshed
okay.
a bit better, but if you happen to be in the WA Parliament, then it's a little slow. But that's okay. It's still very quick in terms of actually getting the material up, which I'm very impressed by. I think in the federal Parliament, you can be waiting a few days before you get any transcripts, whereas in WA, it's up like overnight. So that's really great. And yeah, Lottery West has come up a lot recently. There's been a lot of parliamentary debate on Lottery West because of these controversies. There's been a lot of parliamentary questions, which have been both questions on notice and questions that were not on notice in question time. And then, of course, the transcripts of the estimates hearing. And I'll give a shout out to Peter Collier in the state opposition, who has been really strong on this. And he gave a really powerful speech. I'll give a link to it in the description of just how difficult it was dealing with Lottery West and the government during estimates hearing. So estimates is a hearing where all public agencies must attend to give an account of what's in their annual report and describe, the issues that are affecting their agency. And they take questions from parliamentarians. So this is parliamentarians having an opportunity to question agency heads direct about the things that are affecting their business. And so you see that at the federal level, they'll interview, defense chiefs and foreign affairs, like diplomats and so on, and they will ask literally anything related to that portfolio.
Yeah, well, it is checks and balances, right?
Yes, checks and balances is a really important part of the governing process, and they will ask any question at all. And then the answer from the officials will either be immediate because they know the answer, or they'll say, look, I'll take that on notice and get it to you as soon as possible, and usually, within a day or so. So Lottery West showed up to estimates to face questions, unsurprisingly focused on a lot of this stuff about how they're allocating grants. And the response from the government was amazing. And they really shut down this incredibly critical part of parliamentary accountability. And that was an embarrassment. And I think Peter Collier's speech really called that out quite well. And then the corporate executive, it must be said, despite it being completely obvious what the topic of the estimates hearing was about, seemed spectacularly unprepared in terms of the information they had on hand, which can only be assumed as incredibly poor preparation. So
they didn't have you.
Well, they did have me. That's the thing. I only quit afterwards, and in terms of my areas of responsibility, my corporate report was very well prepared with the answers that they should have been provided with for the questions that were likely to come up, but they weren't asked many questions. So, because it was focused on this critical issue of whether or not grants are being allocated based on personal beliefs and not based on the value of the grant, the community benefit.
Yeah.
So yes, Hansard, I do recommend go have a look at it. Hansard's a really interesting thing as well. You do get a lot of honest thoughts in Hansard as well, because there's what's called parliamentary privilege. So if you say something in good faith, if you're not deliberately misleading, then you can't be caught up in a court of law. You can't cite any Hansard transcript in court under most circumstances. So if you want to so for example, for this Lottery West case, there will be a court case which involves the aggrieved parties, in this case Victory Life, effectively suing Lottery West for breach of the Equal Opportunity Act, and there will be court proceedings and all of that. But everything that was said in Parliament cannot be used in the courtroom, right? So the Hansard is there as a record of our democracy, but it isn't used for court purposes. So people aren't sued for things they say, in court, in the Parliament.
So is that where, like, when you write your local MP and all the parliamentarians, it could come up in Hansard?
Yeah.
Or anything really, right?
Absolutely, on any topic. Use keywords, like if there's something you're interested in and it's ever been talked about in Parliament before, you absolutely can get the copies of that. If there are various parliamentary reports that have been tabled, inquiries,
That's good. And then you can kind of see like who would support your argument. Say, I don't know, you're interested in homelessness or interested in food and whatever. Like you could see which parliamentarians are actually reported on that.
Yes, you absolutely can do that. And also, if there's a parliamentary inquiry and you are trying to consult with groups that have an interest in a particular topic, it's really useful to get on Hansard and see, look, what parliamentary inquiries have there been, say, in online poker, and then you can go to like all the supporting groups, and you can communicate with them. You say, okay, well, these are people who wrote submissions to that inquiry, and these are the submissions that seem positive on the side that I'm interested in. Ergo, I should communicate with them and try and create a bit of a network and a base of support. So Hansard is for many reasons, for many audiences, probably the most underutilized tool in the sense that it's really useful for researchers who want to, historians and things like that. It's really useful for activists. It's really useful for media and other sources who want to report on things that have been said and happened in the past. So yeah, it's a great tool, and it's astonishing to me that so few people know about it. And much less use it, because I think it's something that everyone in school should be forced to actually access and look up and use, so that they can understand civic life a bit better, because everything that is said in Parliament is recorded.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Oh yeah, what else have you been doing this week? Have you been sleeping in? Is that all what you've been doing? Because I would. Actually, to be honest, we're kind of both unemployed, so... Because I graduated and I'm just like, oh, now it's job searching time. But
yes, you're at that wonderful cusp before embarking on a very, no doubt, very prosperous career. For me, no, I haven't really been sleeping in, not by choice. It's just that like I've still got that force of habit. When you like set your alarm and you always wake up like 5 minutes before the alarm. I still have that body clock, so I'm still waking up at exactly the time that I was before. In fact, I'm getting marginally less sleep because I'm trying to play a bit more poker. But hopefully that will change. Other things I've been doing, there's a lot of projects and things that I had on the back burner or are coming along more slowly that have now come to the foreground as things that I can focus on. And no doubt for our more loyal audience, I hopefully be happy with that. I'm doing a lot more recording. I have time on my hands to do more research for the things that we record, and able to make sure we get out more episodes, but also noting that the money constraints do also constrain the opportunities when it comes to editing and things like that. So we will see. Also, the studio that we're in costs money, so we'll do some experimentation about other places that we might record from, if we can still maintain the sort of audio quality and visuals and so on. If we can do that on a shoestring, and then we'll absolutely do that. Also, it opens up opportunities in terms of what we might be able to do that I otherwise didn't have time for. So I can drive places and get proper interviews with people that are of relevance. So,
ladies, he has a car now. When my mum found out he was bought a car, you can get it's like, Crispin can get a girlfriend. My mum's a big supporter of our show.
Oh, it's good. It's good. Hello.
Shout out to my mum.
Yes. Well, the reason I didn't have a car is because I live in the city. But this city does really require a car. Even if you do live in the city, it's such a sprawled place that to get anywhere, so I got a car. I've spoken with a lot of politicians. I've got more meetings with politicians this week. I've got various lobby groups, people who are interested in this case. So that has been all of last week. It'll be most of this week. I anticipate a bit of a lull, probably the end of this week and thereafter as we move into December and Christmas.
That's true.
I think that will be when I've got some time on my hands to really think. And I need to also think about next step in my career. It's a real challenge, because if I had left under different circumstances, I would have had the best possible references and moved into a career that would be the next obvious step in the public service sort of hierarchy ladder. I'm like would have been very standard. My career in the public service has been meteoric, the departure under extraordinary circumstances.
What stopped you from just leaving quietly and then whistleblowing?
Well, because I think it's unfair to the organisation. Like, I don't hate anybody there, and I don't want to stab anyone in the back. Like, I actually think that people there are generally good people. They've got a degree of moral confusion in some places, and a certain degree of a lack of understanding about what their true responsibilities are. But I don't think they're bad people. And if they had a better understanding, if they had better clarity around in their own minds what it means to be a public official, then none of this would have happened. I don't think it's these people being nefarious. There are a few staff members. These are people that I don't personally report to, but there are a few staff members that do think it's appropriate to use public sector money for private social agendas. And that's really disconcerting, and those people do need to be held to account. Even them, it's just perhaps a lack of education, a lack of understanding as to what it means to be a public official. But I think there is a broader problem as well that we should be cognizant of, is that whether it be in the media, whether it be in academia, and whether it now be in certain government institutions, there was a generation gap where a lot of normal democratic liberal values were lost, and people in the universities were hyperactive activists who really saw authoritarian uses of power to impose a particular ideology as legitimate. And I don't think anyone took them seriously. I think they were just like, this kind of activism is what you'll see in universities. They'll grow out of it. Yeah. And then when it became kind of pervasive within the universities, all the deplatformings we saw in the US, all the student bodies that were basically getting academics they didn't like doxxed and fired and so on. It was assumed that, okay, well, yes, it's happening in the academic world, but universities themselves are a bit crazy and detached and ivory-towered. It's not really going to play out properly in the real world. And then these people graduated and took these views to these various institutions that they were employed in and have had a radical effect on these institutions. And I think the New York Times is a great example where Senator Tom Cotton's, a Republican, had an opinion piece published. The New York Times wasn't for or against it. It was basically just doing straight reporting. And all these, must be said, quite young journalists at the New York Times said that it made them feel terrified and afraid that such voices were being platformed on the New York Times. And then the New York Times opinion editor was forced to resign. So we do have this kind of inculcated intersectional radical woke culture that is infecting our institutions. And I think that to a degree it has infected Australian institutions as well. But
still a lot of things about, a lot to think about.
Yeah, and look, there's nothing. You can have those views. I don't agree with those views, but you can have those views. You just have to exercise them in the appropriate way. Yeah. And the thing that I keep bringing up in my interviews with this amazing case was that I'm doing this in part for staff who have deep religious views, who nevertheless subordinate their views in their public role. So you might be a deeply conservative Catholic who believes that like abortion is evil, right? Yeah. But if you are a public official, you still support family planning, counselling and all of that if it's an appropriate grant that fits the criteria, which they do. Or they might support an arts program that lampoons their own Catholic faith, right? They don't use their religious views to impose it on the rest of society. But what we are seeing from the board and some members of the exec is that that they won't be extended that courtesy, that they can subordinate their belief system, but don't expect the decision makers to subordinate theirs either. So it's a real a really painful thing to see people actually being victimized in that way, to feel like the government isn't a place for them just because they happen to be religious, even though religious people make up a portion of our society, a big portion of our society, and have made an enormous contribution to it.
Crispin, it's scary. It's actually scary because, yeah. And I think we brought it up last week, and I was kind of like, that is a good term when people are politically homeless. Right? Like, I love that. Can I own that? I want it on a shirt because sometimes I'm just kind of like, I believe in my discipline, which is health promotion and public health, very much so. But there is definitely a concentration of like research that doesn't get researched, actually. Like, we don't touch, well, I know some research out there that just do not touch like things to do with gender or things to do with like those kind of ideologies, because it's something that's really controversial.
And it shouldn't be. It should just be science, right? Like,
yes,
it should it should just be facts. And it's interesting that that we've changed in these perspectives. Like, for example, before, for a while now, it's been said that women shouldn't drink as much in order to drive because their blood alcohol level will go faster and therefore more likely to blow the limits when they're driving.
Oh, I can vouch that, man.
Yeah.
I have one drink, I'm on the floor.
Yeah. This has been the case for decades, I guess, now, which has been the rule. It's like, okay, if you're a guy, don't have a third drink within an hour. If you're a girl, don't have a second drink within an hour.
Yeah.
And uncontroversial, right? But imagine if that was being discovered now. Imagine if you had to put out today that women shouldn't be able to drink as much as men and drive. Could you imagine that in the current political climate, actually putting that out? Like, would you be like, actually, I think we're just going to sit on this bit of news and we won't give any guidance on how to do it. We'll say, look, 0.05 is the limit for everybody. And we're not going to tell people how to keep within that limit, because the idea that, like, it sounds ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But it is easy to imagine it become an incredibly politically toxic thing to say that women shouldn't be allowed to drink as much as men, because then you would have a whole wave of people come in and be like, oh, okay, so now like our drinking culture is women's fault, and like, I mean, you could just imagine it, right? Thankfully, it's well established, and therefore people haven't thought about it. But if people did, you might have a thing of
please
saying,
don't give people ideas.
yeah, and instead you might be like, or maybe women need a higher blood alcohol tolerance for driving. Like that, so there is equality. It's that sort of thing. And vice versa. We will never see it on the other foot, but insurance costs more if you're a guy than if you're a girl.
Way more.
Yeah, and
200.
Yeah, it's a lot more, and it's not. And that's pure discrimination, right? Like, there is actually a case there to say, hang on a second. Yes, you might say that guys take more risks on average, and therefore, on average, guys are much more likely to have an accident. But you are generalizing there. You are doing laws of averages, but that's how insurance is calculated, right? They don't look at you as an individual. What they do is they look at your characteristics and they go, what is the probability of everybody with those characteristics having an accident that costs us money, right? So they charge you on that basis. So you are actually paying the most for the lowest common denominator, if you like. It's not like they've actually gone out of their way to interview you personally, to take a personal assessment of all of your characteristics and say, okay, well, actually, you're a pretty safe driver, and therefore we think the risk is equal to that. Well, they don't do that, right? And that's a discrimination that we've accepted in our society. But again, if that was on the other foot, if that was like women paying more for insurance, I mean, we, like in the current climate, if they tried to change it, if there are things that you want to take insurance on that may be worse for women, so I don't know what. Like, I'm sure there are things that affect women a lot more than men. So, and therefore, I doubt insurance companies could get away with it. I think they would be absolutely hounded and attacked, and they'd be like,
such a double standard now thinking about it. Like,
it is.
At the same time, yeah.
It is, but it's not like it. It
So
was
in a-
originally out of love. You know, it was originally like there were things, the real barriers that women had that have been taken down. But now, no one can say we have equality because otherwise, a lot of these people have nothing to do. I mean,
yeah, inequalities just exist everywhere. It's just which ones do we accept and which ones we don't accept.
well, that's a really interesting point, actually. So there are inequities all across life, right? There are good-looking people, and there are unattractive, and there are unattractive people. There are people who are rich, and there are people who are poor. There are people who have happy, healthy relationships, people who are not, people who are healthy, people who are not, people who have children who are well-adjusted and easy to manage, and there are people who have children who have real problems, right? Like day-to-day life, there is inequities everywhere. And in fact, a lot of the science is interesting on this, like, how much more you earn if you're tall, right? That's
really?
Yeah. So there is a proportionality there. If you're tall,
But
then you will earn more.
Industries are rising, so I don't think height really matters.
Well, I'm sure it's changing in some areas, right? But it's just one of those things. Like if you're tall, people remember you. You have more physical presence. You're more like, when you ask for pay rises and things, people kind of see you more seriously. So there's actually a lot of benefits to being tall. There's also a lot of benefits to being attractive. And interestingly, it's more beneficial to be a male who's attractive than a female who's attractive. I know that sounds really bizarre, but the reason is, and I'm talking about in terms of sheer dollars, right? There are other reasons why being an attractive female is much more beneficial. But in terms of your career, and this is a negative, pernicious thing, there's no discombobulation in someone's mind if a guy is attractive but also highly intelligent, right? Like people go, oh yeah, that like you can be ugly and intelligent, and you can be attractive and intelligent, and as a guy, it's just assumed that that's completely an irrelevant factor to whether or not you are able to do the job. Whereas for women, if they're super attractive, right, there is in the back of the mind, people's thinking that maybe they've only got to where they are because they're attractive, right?
Yeah.
And so they're discounted in terms of their capabilities often because they're attractive. So it's a pernicious effect, okay?
That's a bit creepy.
Yeah. I mean, but having said that, like it's definitely better to be attractive, right? Being attractive gives you enormous benefits. People treat you massively different. But just in terms of getting a pay rise or a promotion, being physically attractive for a female is only a marginal benefit, whereas for a guy, it's a significant benefit because they're attractive, which gives them like impact on others, right? Female superiors and so on, or other males that are that way inclined. Without the discounting effect. They go, well, yeah, super attractive and brilliant and all the rest, right? Whereas that's a step that women take a little longer on in the workplace. So there are biases that still exist. A lot of biases
like
against
confidence. Like I think like attractiveness, looks are like subjective. Isn't it just like confidence and assertiveness? And I feel like for women, we're very much agreeable. We're very much more agreeable. That's why we don't really get pay rises, because we just kind of accept the way things are. Which I have challenged myself this week, which is good.
Yeah, 100%.
We'll update later.
100%. Yeah, it's not attractiveness. That's true. It's personality, and women tend to be far more agreeable and put up with things that men would not put up with. And so that's true. That is the number one reason why women don't get the pay rises, other than the fact, well, actually, probably the number one reason is they often take time out of the workplace for families and so on. But in terms of actually competing, that's the biggest issue.
Yeah, because like I think I hear all the time with like applying for jobs is that when a woman tries to apply for a job, she'll look at say like the 5 criteria, and just be like, oh, I can do 4. I can't apply for this job. For a guy, he's like, I can do 4. Yeah, okay, I can apply for this job. Like, the 5th one does not matter anymore. Like, I've had mentors come up to me. He's like, you need to apply like a man. I'm like, what do you mean?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good bit of advice. Okay, so let's pause there. We're about the 30 minutes. That's what I was pointing at. I was like,
a report that came out about war crimes. Definitely very challenging.
Yeah, incredibly confronting.
Yeah. And I just don't understand. I guess you had a few recommendations way forward, right? It was increase transparency, have part of the memorial, and change the culture itself.
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar, go have a look at the video on Australia's war crimes. There was a report that came out recently called the Bereton report, and it detailed astonishing acts of barbarity on behalf and perpetrated by our Special Air Service Regiment, which until today had been the most hallowed fighting force in Australia's culture. And the cases involved 39 separate instances of Afghani civilians being massacred by at least 25 SAS service regiment soldiers. And that means that this happened over a prolonged period of time, that a lot of people were involved, and no one said anything. And this is beyond defensible. Like I made an earlier video which kind of looked at one incident that was allegedly in the report, and I came up with scenarios as to how this could happen, not justifying, but still saying, look, in the context of a conflict, it could happen, and that doesn't necessarily condemn anybody. Whereas this is a systemic problem and shames the nation to a very deep degree, a deep pathos in our culture about this. And I think we're still in shock. And it was on the front page of the paper. So unfortunately, my Lottery West thing wasn't page 1. What was page 1 is the SAS and the massacres.
I think it's a little bit more important.
Understandably more important, yes. And also a big shout out to the whistleblowers involved in that case, because that's a real act of true moral courage. To know that you are going to be attacked, not just by the soldiers that you served with, but also your own hierarchy. There are people in government who don't want the report released at all because they think it hands our adversaries propaganda victories, and we've seen the Chinese and the Russians and so on make speeches on it already, right? So they are using it for that purpose, but that's the truth. Like, we are a democracy, we have transparency. So it's a real shame, and it did lead to a lengthy discussion about the nature of war.
Yeah.
And what we need to do is, I agree with Andrew Hastie that we have more transparency. We need to have more media and journalists out there embedded on the ground for these conflict zones. And as I said in the video, there is a history behind that, wherein militaries closed themselves off to those kinds of scrutinies because of what happened in Vietnam. In Vietnam, it was television war. Like, it was the first time television was a thing where everybody had televisions at home. And because it was fresh, the military hadn't really thought about it. So they had journalists over there, and they would have live camera feeds rolling, and you would see the horrors and pictures of war. Like, if you want to see pictures of death, just look up the Vietnam War, because that was a television war shooting right into people's living rooms, what was happening out there on the front line. And you don't see that anymore. And what we have here in Australia with Afghanistan is the country isn't even at war. Like, at least in Vietnam, everyone understood there was a war, there was a draft, people were being conscripted. Whereas in this conflict, people just live their day-to-day lives, and yet you have these soldiers doing their 6, 7, 8 tours, spending so much time away from their families, and they come back to life, and life is just happening as normal. There's no one has any connection to their experience. And then you have politicians spinning a very sanitized view of what we were doing there, i.e., opening schools and building roads and things like that, not actually what our special forces are there to do, which is to fight and kill. So it was a very, it's understandable that things could happen in a culture of secrecy because everyone had an interest in the secrecy. The military had an interest in the secrecy, the politicians had an interest in the secrecy, and the soldiers themselves, obviously, who were doing it. So that's the first problem. We need to open that up. And historically, Australia, even before this, had an attitude of secrecy towards the SAS, the idea that we would have this elite fighting force that no one really knew anything about. It's part of, like, so in the United States, you know, you have your Navy SEALs and your SEAL Team 6 and all that sort of stuff, and they're almost celebrities, right? Their operations are secret, but the actual day-to-day stuff for them, you know, there's a sort of culture of support, right? Whereas in Australia and Britain and the sort of, you know, traditional, Westminster styles, military forces is a secret kind of way to live, right? You're not supposed to be in the public eye. You're supposed to sit there in the shadows and just be professional and competent. And I think that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. It's so inhumane, and I just feel like it's so un-Australian. When I read or watched the video, then read some of the report, I was just kind of like, this is brutal. And I think, like you said, they did so many rounds that I feel like they've probably lost touch of humanity because they are like trained like machines.
Yes, right? Yes, and we do have a shared responsibility. And I take that. I mean, at that point, that thing you said, it's un-Australian. I think that's what's got people. Is that the SAS is supposed to be the best of us, and they've proven themselves to be the worst in many ways. So that's deeply painful from a national cultural psyche perspective.
Yeah, it's just like when we stand up for Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, and yeah, when we really look up to these soldiers protecting us, saying it just, wow.
But then also, this is an interesting thing as well, in the sense that we've always lied to ourselves about the nature of war, right? Like, civilians die in war. They do, you know. And in all the wars that Australia has fought, civilians have died. So while this series of instances is particularly painful, one of the reasons we are so shocked, one of the reasons we are so grieving, is because we have had this romanticized pre-Napoleonic vision of conflict when it comes to our soldiery, when in fact that's not what war is and never ever was. So there has been a conflict in the minds of our soldiers because they're not trained to be moral agents. They're not ministers. You know, they're there as fighting units. And the culture, as Andrew Hastie put it, and I think it's kind of eloquent, was a sort of culture of Achilles, a culture of Ares, the blood and thirst of battle. And that is what we asked them to do. So there is, you know, they as individuals have moral agency and are required to abide by minimum standards of rules of war and conduct. And the fact that you have, despite this inculcation, some individuals who are trained killers, who are trained soldiers, who still come out publicly and with a high degree of moral virtue and courage, call out this behavior, shows that people can act as moral agents in these environments. So exceptional heroism in their case, and why I think we need it in the War Memorial, because the War Memorial is basically a shrine to all the glories and wonders of our wartime past. And I think that this particular marker, that every student that comes to the War Memorial, every, you know, pupil and parent and so on, to be able to see a part of the War Memorial dedicated to the real nature and risk and moral hazard of war would be incredibly valuable. And help us remember not to go down this path again. As for the SAS themselves, I think it's going to take time. I think just as a nation, we're going to have to adjust to this reality, and then to have cool heads when it comes to what we do with these soldiers, because we actually need the SAS. We do. Like, they do things that no one could do, right? That's why they are the elite sport fighting force. That's why the people that join the SAS are special people. And they give capabilities not only to our nation, but to our allies. They have a special set of skills that are rare among even special forces units of other countries. So, so those kinds of contingencies, we will continue to need them for. But how exactly the culture should change, what mechanisms should be in place to make sure, and it also has to be in a way that doesn't undermine the operations. Like, one of the great frustrations of people in Afghanistan was the constant need to report everything that had happened. I mean, as one general put it, every time a guy lost a goat, they would have to put in a report, you know.
Yeah.
And so that was their frustration, like operating under these constraints. Now, I don't think these constraints are going to be any lighter after this report. So how we manage this in just in a pragmatic, practical sense is going to be an interesting exercise.
This is a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We didn't have those calls to disband the SAS. We didn't have them. Will we just be overrun by other countries?
No, we won't. But see, there are multiple strategic objectives of our Australian Defence Force. The first objective is to defend Australia. And although that should be their primary focus, I don't think that the force structure is set up appropriately for that objective. And the reason for that, there's a few reasons, but the reason for that at the moment is because what we actually get them to do is not defend Australia. Like, we're not using them to defend our northern approaches. What we're using them for is various contingencies with allies, right? So, and there are things that our SAS did that were really great. Like, for example, in the first, when the US went into Iraq, one of the great risks was that Saddam Hussein would launch all his Scud missiles, which are quite powerful conventional ballistic missiles, at Israel, because they were very, very dangerous missiles and very easy to use them to retaliate against a key American ally and an ally of Australia.
Yeah.
So the SAS went in before the invasion in secret and took out all these missiles deep behind enemy lines. This could have gone horribly wrong. It could have informed the leadership about the imminent invasion, because you would have foreign troops operating on your soil.
Yeah.
This is very hard to extract them. They had to travel basically by foot over vast distances. And what they were seeking to do had required total surprise, because otherwise they fire those missiles anyway.
Yeah.
So extraordinary act of professionalism, precision, dedication, and service. And that, like, it saved. We won't know how many Israelis would have died if it wasn't for that act. And you couldn't do that any other way. You couldn't do it with distant missiles, because you detect them and they can fire them anyway. It had to be by actual people on the ground doing the job. So
that's insane.
Yeah, and enormous personal risk, right?
Yeah.
You know, but the likelihood of being captured is just
And
so
blown up,
high.
yeah.
So this kind of work is something that only very special people can do. That requires millions of dollars of training, and the selection process is absolutely savage. So we do need them. They're not really there to defend Australia's shores. Of course, if we ever were attacked, they would be on the front lines. But they're there to go places that other people can't go. So their primary function as a special forces unit, obviously there are multiple different branches, but their primary function is long-range reconnaissance, i.e. deep behind enemy lines, very remote places where they can survive on their own without support for long periods of time and conduct offensive operations. That's not easy for people to do. They have to spend a lot of time by themselves with others without support. And that's what the SAS are basically trained to do.
I have a lot of respect, but still complicated. But a lot of respect.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's the problem. We need to keep what's good and unique, and take away everything that is toxic and cancerous. And we need to be held account for the things that we've done. I think as a nation, we need to find these people who have been affected, these families that have been destroyed by our actions, and offer compensation and find, properly make up for these crimes. And then reform the SAS in a way that no one ever forgets. I wouldn't have a problem with a little remembrance on their uniforms, to be honest. Just something that people wear as a reminder of what can happen when people lose their moral agency. And also, I think we should introduce some honours for moral acts of courage. I think that what Andrew Hastie's words about that, we should have medals for people who make hard decisions, but for humane reasons, and that those reasons become vindicated. But yes, I take your point. We should finish on something much more positive.
Yeah. It's an extra long episode, but that's okay. Yeah.
All right. So let's finish with some final thoughts.
Yeah. So it's trying to be a bit positive, right? So Australia has a big drinking culture. That could be a topic too later because of the tariffs from China. But yes. I was just on a wine tour actually on Saturday. And
wow.
Wow.
Oh, wow. It's good.
And it was great, but it kind of reminded me just my intolerance for alcohol. I don't generally drink. Now, neither does my boyfriend. So we're just kind of having this, and we're like, oh my goodness. I hit the end and I was like, my head is thumping. And I think I've had 2 drinks. And my head was thumping. I was like, this is why I don't drink. I'm hungover. The world's going to end. Well, I'm female, I'm Asian, and I'm small, so give me a break. All the odds stack against me. Science. It all stacks against me.
Science. It's practice is what it is.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being intolerant to alcohol because I'm a cheap drunk, right? Just give me a shot. I'll be on the floor. It's fine. And I save money because alcohol is really expensive in Australia. They have a big taxation thing.
Yes.
So, yeah. You cannot get $2 Coronas here. You're paying $10 minimum.
Well, no, you're paying. You'll pay
when you go out. I mean,
yeah, if you're at a nightclub or something, you might pay. You won't. If you go to a bottle shop and get it, won't be that much.
Yeah, but still, there's
there's a lot of tax.
Significant. Yeah.
There is a lot of tax. Damn health promotion people ruining it for everybody.
Just protecting lives.
Protecting revenue.
See, now this is where it happens. What about you? What's your final thoughts or things?
I think that we are on the cusp of some interesting breakthroughs in technology. One of the things that that happens with massive crises is leaps in technological progress, and the sorts of things that people have come up with to kind of adapt to the COVID era and augment that. I think we will see, some fantastic new things over the next year coming out of the pipeline that will really be the next sort of leap in our, from the iPhone to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
There was some other discussion, interestingly, about the way relationships work over distance and things like that, whether or not these things will become more normal. That people will, because for a while, people would, perhaps meet online, have a casual sort of thing, and then they may or may not meet offline. But people would seldom be able to sustain relationships for long periods of time if they were previously together, and then one person moved somewhere else, and then they maintained a long distance thing. Well, that was kind of rare. There was always that sense that people would only be able to maintain that for brief periods of time, with a clear plan for the solution, the resolution. But I've met people who, to their great credit, have managed to maintain relationships for long periods of time when people are trapped in other parts of the world without any sense of knowing when it's going to end. And so I think that the technology that has allowed that to be sustained, I think there'll be more technologies like that kind of help maintain relationships over distance, help kind of social interaction generally, and of course, and most profoundly, help workplaces operate remotely. So I think we're on a real cusp of something here, and I'll do a video at some point on all the big changes that are happening down the pipeline. But I think 12 months from now, we're going to be, I'll be looking back on this and being like, look, there's some significant breakthroughs that happened as a result of the COVID period. So there is a silver lining in terms of technological progress and making it easier for people to do work when they're by themselves or maintain relationships.
Yeah. And on that note, we have a vaccine. Apparently coming in March.
Yes, so there's a few vaccines. There's the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, and the Oxford vaccine. They all have their pros and cons.
Was it worth it? Was this all worth it?
We will see. If the vaccine eradicates the disease, then yes, it'll all have been worth it, because we have managed to suppress the disease here in Australia completely effectively. So if we all then get the vaccine, open the borders, then we can say, hand on heart, that we saved a lot of lives. Do I think, but that's a big if. Do I think it's been worth it for the rest of the world? No, I don't. I think that the shutdowns and things that they've had have been far too costly for not enough gain. See, the thing that makes it worth it for Australia is that we had very temporary lockdowns, and now everything's kind of opened up, and so people can, except for certain travel restrictions, be able to lead relatively normal lives. Whereas for much of the world, they're constantly going into lockdown and coming out of lockdown, and they've got infections the whole time, and their economy is being destroyed, and confidence is being destroyed, and people don't know, like, you know, in our day-to-day lives, we can have a certain degree of confidence that next week will be much like this week, right? Whereas in other parts of the world, that's not the case. So I don't think it has been justified the rest of the world. And then with this vaccines, it remains to be seen whether these vaccines are the panacea, because they often need boosts. They need to be kind of done every year or so. Is it possible to eliminate the disease such that we stop needing the vaccine after a couple of years? Does the vaccine not mutate? Do we need to adjust the vaccine year to year like we do with the flu vaccine? I don't know. So there's a lot that is still question mark. And then, you know, is everyone going to get access to the vaccine? That's another question as well. So
I'm trying to leave it on a positive note.
No.
Thanks.
Well, no. Like it's not a negative note. Like, it's fantastic that we have the vaccine. Like, absolutely it is, and it will have saved many, many lives. But we just need to make sure we just have to, like, this idea that everything is going to go back to the way it was. That's a lie. No one should think that.
You don't think when we hit the first of 2021, the whole world will?
No, I think the Northern Hemisphere's got a very dark winter ahead of them. And then when the vaccine has been widely distributed, say like March next year or so, we will see improvements, but we will not, like, life itself will have changed dramatically, and we'll have many more videos on that. But no, I mean, it's good. We got the vaccine. Things will be going well.
All right. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. Extended episode, but that's fine. Any questions, any comments, please leave them down below. Otherwise, check out our last videos. Particularly, we'll link them as well.
Do subscribe. Absolutely subscribe. We're getting more subscribers, which is great. But we want to hit that 1,000 as quickly as we can. So please sign up.
Please, we're both unemployed. We need to monetize.
All right. See you next time.